It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilbert coming to you from Baltimore. According to government estimates, 84,000 so-called Yellow Vest protesters took to the streets across France on the 10th consecutive Saturday of protests. Yellow Vest protesters themselves say the number is an underestimate. These protests, with at times violent clashes with the police, have been roiling France for well over 2 months now. The protests are named after the yellow emergency vest that protesters wear and that all private cars in France are required to carry for an emergency. They began apparently spontaneously in reaction to a gasoline tax that President Macron imposed last November, but have morphed into a far broader expression of discontent against the economic situation of working class and lower middle class families in France. Joining me now from Paris, France, to analyze the latest developments with the Yellow Vest protests is Cole Stangler. He is a freelance journalist covering French labor and politics. Thanks for joining us again, Cole.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the Yellow Vest protests in France have been going on for 10 consecutive weeks now, every Saturday, as I said. And according to opinion polls, the vast majority of the population in France seems to support the movement, even if they aren't participating. What is the latest status of this movement, and will it fizzle out, will it continue, or will it evolve?
What's really interesting is the movement appeared to be on the decline for a number of weeks, really never has reached its peak, over 200,000 protesters that first Saturday, November 17th. The movement has been on the decline since then in terms of turnout. It seemed to really be fizzling out around the holidays. People were on vacation and not coming out to protest. And then what we've seen very interestingly since the new year is actually an uptick in the participation again. So 50,000 a couple weekends ago, then 84,000. Then this most past weekend, another 84,000 people coming out into the streets. And there are again calls for a Act 11. Hard to believe that we're on the 11th straight weekend of protest, but that's where things are at. The movement is actually continuing. And as you pointed out, which also another important element here is it continues to benefit from broad public support. The support's still there. It might not be as high as it was from the very beginning, but polls are still showing about 60% public support. The interesting question now is, what are these protests about? We've seen the government already give that concession of the fuel tax increase. They canceled that fuel tax increase for 2019. They then went ahead and had a number of other concessions, 3 big concessions, including an increase of a state wage subsidy for low-income workers. They've gotten all that, and the protests are continuing. So, it's going to be interesting to see what's the next phase of this.
So President Macron has tried to diffuse the movement, it seems, by organizing town hall events similar in smaller cities where he says he wants to listen to people's complaints about the government. Has this strategy worked? I mean, what has been the result of this?
Well, Macron has kicked off this initiative, what they've been billing as a great national debate. And so it's going to be involving mayors in the local level of France. The way the government works, there's lots of mayors that represent lots of small towns, so that tend to be pretty close to the communities. The idea is discussions with mayors in these kind of town hall settings. He kicked it off in Normandy last week. You also have a phase that's supposedly going to be rolled out online, where people will be able to actually put their input in. And there are really 4 key areas of focus, the way the government has outlined it. So taxes and public spending, public services, the environmental transition, and democracy and citizenship. These are the 4 big themes they want to have this debate around. Now, the key part about this debate is you can say you're having discussions, you can say you're listening to the population, but what does it mean if there aren't real accountability mechanisms built into the process? And that's kind of been the main critique here is, there's no guarantee that at the end of the day, after a few months of these talks, there's no mechanism to ensure the government is going to be automatically, say, putting forth legislation that's reflecting what they're hearing. And so one of the big demands of protesters here, and they've been very diffuse, but one of the kind of central demands, if there is one central demand at this point, has been this question of a citizens referendum initiative. This is an idea that has been inspired by other experiences in Europe and around the world. So Switzerland has a referendum initiative in their country, and the idea of this referendum would allow citizens to revoke legislators they don't like. It would allow them to propose legislation on their own. It would allow them to make amendments to the Constitution. And this is one of the closest thing we have at this point to a real kind of coherent, universally shared demand of the movement. And what will be interesting to see is if the government's going to include this referendum initiative as part of their town hall, part of this grand debate. And for pretty obvious reasons, that might not want to be, not be something they want to do.
Interesting. Another strategy of the government, though, has been to prevent people from gathering in central traffic roundabouts, which has been a key gathering area for the Yellow Vest protests across the country. It's kind of reminiscent, it seems to me, to the public parks where the Occupy movement in the United States was gathering and then was expelled from. How important have been these gathering places, and is their dismantling having an effect on the movement?
Well, these gathering points are huge for the movement. This is what gave the LOS movement this initial visibility. And what's so interesting about the movement, among other things, is the fact that precisely these gatherings were taking place in not traditional protest places. These aren't taking places. These aren't taking place in the center of Paris every week. Every day. They're just taking place in traffic roundabouts in rural France, in the north, in the south. Parts of the country that aren't accustomed to having protests. And so these points were such an important, point of visibility for the movement, especially, in these communities where they've gotten their support from. When you go to these roundabouts to meet people, to discuss politics. And I think one of the most interesting points of the movement, which again, I think, harkens back to Occupy, was the sense that people were coming to these roundabouts to discuss politics and to feel a little less lonely. I know that sounds kind of trite, but I think it's important. Politics is about feeling like wanting to have some control over your life. And this was really an important part of the movement, was coming to these roundabouts and discussing politics, sharing grievances, and venting these common frustrations. So what we've seen actually is as I pointed out at the beginning here, is the protest figures have actually continued to go up now since an initial decline. So it's clear, I think, just based on that alone, that the movement is not dead, and in fact, very much still alive.
So, and how are other opposition parties in France reacting to these protests? Are they receiving any support from any of the sides, either the left or the right?
Well, I think the most significant support we've seen from the beginning came from both the far right, again, just verbal support, and I think that they printed some materials in support of the protest at the very beginning. So the far right National Front, which has now rebranded itself as the National Rally Party, led by Marine Le Pen. You had parts of the far right, another kind of more fringe party led by Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, a smaller party, than the National Rally, also supporting. Also on the left side, on the other side of the spectrum, and I think actually more overtly, more directly, France Insoumise, so translated in different ways, but one of the translations is Rebellious France, this movement led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's a deputy representing now Marseille in the south of France. The France Insoumise has been very supportive of the movement, and the France Insoumise group in Parliament actually put forth a proposal in Parliament that would create this citizens referendum initiative that's been so supported by the protest movement. I don't suspect that'll go anywhere actually in Parliament for the time being, but it's certainly reflective of an effort of Mélenchon's party to show that they support the protests. And Jean-Luc Mélenchon himself as well has been pretty vocally supportive of a number of high-profile Yellow Vest protesters. One in particular, a man named Eric Drouet, who was taken into police custody, and Mélenchon's really tried to show solidarity with him. So, you do have this kind of vocal support. At the same time, a lot of the Yellow Vest protesters do not like traditional political parties. I think we shouldn't, try to romanticize this movement either. It's very messy, and sometimes it's not so clear. There's a real kind of hostility towards traditional political parties, and a hostility in a number of different parts of the country to labor unions. At the same time, Labor is also trying to support it in a number of locations. So very messy movement.
And so all in all, what would you say has the movement accomplished, and where does it go from here?
Well, I think it's clear, just in a really direct sense, that the movement has already gotten the government to cancel this fuel tax increase. They've also gotten those three other concessions. So the biggest one being an expansion of that wage subsidy for low-income workers. They've also gotten the government to de-tax overtime pay, which is controversial in its own right. And then another, those three big measures announced by Macron that would cancel a tax increase that was hitting retirees, so a tax on pensions. So they've accomplished all of that, and it's worth pointing out again, not to romanticize or to take sides here, but it is a fact that in just a couple months of protest, the LLS movement accomplished more than what the French labor movement has been trying to do for years now, which is to actually get the government to back off an unpopular proposal. And in addition to that, in addition to canceling the fuel tax increase, actually get the government to put forth a number of other measures. Now, you can say they don't go far enough, but they put pressure in a way that we just haven't seen from the traditional left and from the traditional labor movement. I think that's why the attitudes are changing from the left and labor in France to to really try to better position themselves with this movement, to try to show solidarity, to try to benefit from the wave of support. As things move forward here, we have another wave of protests. This in addition to more yellow vest protests on Saturday. So Act 11, there's a protest that's been called by supporters of the government to stop the violence, kind of echoes of 1968 there. If you think back to the May 68 protests in France, where you had supporters of de Gaulle coming out to show their support for law and order. You have that. And another important date to look forward to, again, in addition to these seemingly weekly protests that we've been seeing, is the beginning of February, the second biggest labor confederation in France, the CGT, has called for a day of strike and protest. So it'll be very interesting to see if the yellow vests and the labor movement can actually take sides together and join forces. We haven't really seen it in a substantial way to this date. And I think if that does happen, a lot of speculation, we could see things take an even, more, impressive direction in terms of just power and influence of this movement.
Wow. Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on that, but we'll have to leave it there for now. I was speaking to Cole Stangler, freelance journalist covering French labor and politics from Paris, France. Thanks again, Cole, for having joined us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.